are in conversation with the expert session, focusing on the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act 2024. I'm Gemma Cox, CTSI, which is the Chartered Trading Standards Institute, Lead Officer for Civil Law. And today I'm joined by my colleagues, Sylvia Rook and David Mackenzie. Sylvia, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Sylvia Rook. I'm one of the lead officers at CTSI. I'm the lead officer for fair trading.
Hi, I'm David Mackenzie and I'm lead officer for e-commerce at CTSI.
Today we're also joined by Ian Meikle from the Department of Business and Trade. Ian, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. So I was until recently the head of consumer law enforcement policy at the department, and I've been working on implementation of Part 3 and Part 4 of the DMCC.
And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Andrew Hadley from the Competition and Markets Authority. And Andrew, we've worked together for quite some time, so some of the trading standards officers might have met you before. So can you introduce your role, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Andrew Hadley. I'm an Assistant Director in the Policy and Practice team at the Competition and Markets Authority. I've been working with Ian and with CTSI colleagues on DMCC for a few years now and have also worked on previous consumer law guidance. But thanks very much for inviting me along.
Thank you very much, everyone. So let's jump straight in with the discussion, shall we? So Ian, why was the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act needed, and what's its main purpose?
So I guess the basic rationale for Part 3 and bits of Part 4 was that some of the underlying law needed updating after EU exit. So there was some redundant EU definitions or distinctions in Part 8 of the Enterprise Act, and also the CPUTRs was regulations, so that needed to be made into primary legislation. But on the enforcement side, we consulted in the Reforming Competition and Consumer Policy consultation quite a few years ago now, on what was needed to make civil enforcement a more attractive proposition. And I think really two things came out. The first was that there wasn't enough teeth for civil enforcement, so there needed to be tougher penalties. And the second was that delays in the court system were causing difficulties. And so we've introduced two main reforms. The first is the introduction of monetary penalties of up to 10% of global turnover for substantive breaches of consumer law. And there are some tiered other fines for breaches of administrative penalties during the enforcement process. So that applies across the piece and should hopefully make civil enforcement, much more attractive option than it was previously. And the second is to introduce direct enforcement powers of the Competition and Markets Authority, so that hopefully the CMA can undertake enforcement more quickly and more efficiently, and therefore do more of it.
Yeah, and some really important points that we will pick up throughout the course of this discussion. Sylvia, when did CTSI first become aware of the proposed Act, and what involvement did lead officers have at that early stage?
I think we were contacted very early on. I think it's probably back in 2022, something like that. We were first contacted in relation to the fact that this legislation was in process, and we were asked for our views, and we were given the opportunity to say what we thought was going to be of value to trading standards. And then since then, we've been working together throughout the last few years, refining, discussing various points, and it's been a really good collaborative bit of working.
And David, from a CTSI and lead officer perspective, how important is it that CTSI are engaged with at an early stage of this process? And what are your thoughts on the success or engagement level for this particular Act?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely essential. It seems to me that regulators are involved at an early stage, and it isn't just consumer representatives, business representatives of the opportunities to feed in. We need to be there too. We bring our on-the-ground experience of, what really happens in the real world, in the localities, to the table to make better law, isn't it? When we're making law, we need to get all the different perspectives that enable that law to be the best that it can. And I have to say, I totally agree with Sylvia. I think this has been a really good process, a really positive process. On this act, we were involved at an early stage, and we've been able to influence. Didn't get everything we asked for, but you never do. But we've got some significant. We've influenced this in a positive way, and I really have to put my hat, take my hat off to to the Department of Business and Trade and, of course, colleagues in CMA for the way we've worked together. It's been very collegiate and very positive, I feel.
So Sylvia, following on from what David has just said, can you explain a little bit more about the role of lead officers in the process leading up to the Act and how we lobbied to ensure that the voice of trading standards was heard during the process?
Well, we started off at the very early stages with just giving the sort of things that we wanted and minor things like changes in definitions, interpretation things, and moving on to broader areas such as powers and things like that. So we started off just giving our views to DBT, and there were lots and lots of Teams calls about it. But we also got our vice presidents involved, and we were able to lobby in the House of Lords, and people can look up on Hansard and they can see the things that CTSI were asking for. We didn't get them all, but actually we got ourselves heard, we got the communication, and we did get some changes which will be good for trading standards.
Fabulous. And then Ian, just to pick up with yourself, from the perspective of the Department of Business and Trade, were you aware of these representations and did that voice come through from a trading standards perspective?
I certainly was, and it came through loud and clear. I think the first thing to say is that at a policy development stage and at the point when you're refining the bill as it's going into Parliament, it's just really helpful to know what officers on the ground are seeing and what the perspective of trading standards officers is. And the lead officers are obviously a fantastic conduit for that information, helps us make sure that the policy is right as it goes into Parliament. The second thing I'd say is that bills are influenced by noises in the public environment and what stakeholders say in the kind of early engagements when the bill gets out into the public domain. And I think CTSI did a great job both with sort of public messaging, but also in the evidence sessions for the bill. So David gave evidence at the DMCC evidence sessions, and that helped to kind of steer the direction of travel on some issues. And then, as Sylvia points out, the trading standards community is well represented in the Lords through the CTSI vice presidents, and the Earl of Lindsey was kind of at the forefront of a number of amendments that were proposed and debated in the Lords. So it's kind of a continuous trading standards voice throughout, which is really helpful to make sure that the policy is right, but then also influential in how the legislation ends up turning out.
Yeah, I think that's really useful for our members to hear and see the work that lead officers do with yourselves as well to make sure that officers in the trading standards profession are being heard and their voice gets through. So one area of change being introduced by the Act are changes to the civil enforcement regime, which trading standards would be used to referring to as Part 8 action under the Enterprise Act. And many officers will be familiar with concepts such as consultation, undertakings and enforcement orders. And many of these key concepts will still be retained in the new Act. Ian, in addition to those more familiar parts of the Act, there are some new changes, aren't there, coming in? And one of these changes is the introduction of the new monetary penalties that you referred to earlier on. So can you briefly explain what these are and how they're likely to strengthen the powers of trading standards?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the kind of headline figure is that penalties available of up to 10% of global turnover for a breach of a substantive consumer law. And that gets tiered down to 5% of global turnover when you're talking about a breach of undertakings, and then 1% of turnover for breach of an information notice sent out under Schedule 5 of the Consumer Rights Act. And the intention of those is really just to make sure that court orders have teeth and that there's a disincentive to breaching those. There's a set of quite technical regulations that are now on the statute book that are going to be used to calculate turnover. But the headline, I think, for officers to understand is that it should be based on, we've tried to make sure that the regulations are as closely as possible based on the publicly available turnover figures of companies. So it should be reasonably straightforward to calculate what a penalty is that you're seeking. And I think Andrew might talk later in the session about some really helpful guidance that the CMA are putting out about those. I think it's also really important to flag that in the new provisions, undertakings, if they're breached, are attract a penalty, a monetary penalty without further court action. So you just go straight to court for breach of the undertaking. So the issue with Enterprise Act undertakings, whereby you'd agree an undertaking, but then it didn't really make any difference to the progress of the case because you just have to bring enforcement action if the trader breached, ought to be resolved. And we hope that that ought to hit a kind of sweet spot where you can resolve proceedings quickly, but still with teeth or with consequences if the trader goes on to breach.
Fabulous. And David, what impact do you think that these new monetary penalties will have in practice on the trading standards profession?
Well, very significant benefits, it seems to me. I mean, there will be situations, as Ian's laid out there, where, you know, cases do go to court, either for breach of undertaking or potentially just, you know, an initial order, where there will be significant punitive monetary penalties that offenders will face, you know, which really does give extra teeth to the legislation. It brings a punitive element in to, you know, supplement what we've already got in terms of restorative and injunctive rules that were there before. But it seems to me that more often than that, much more often than that, the benefit will be that it acts as a lever to get things sorted at an earlier stage. If we have, you know, this is the backstop, if you like, this underpins it. You could face these substantial financial penalties if you don't cooperate and do the right thing and treat customers in the way that you should. That's a theme that runs through this in a few different positions, but it certainly applies here. So I'm really enthusiastic about it, and I think it's a possibly even an opportunity for a little bit of a step change in our use of civil enforcement, in that we've already got some really good provisions in there about enhanced consumer measures and so on, but now it's supplemented with this punitive element. It really is time, it seems to me, for all authorities across the UK to be looking very carefully at using civil enforcement.
And we've talked, haven't we, David, about the need to supplement that with support and training for our members.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just with trading standards officer level, but maybe at managerial level and legal level as well.
Yeah.
So I know there's something else that we're looking at to help support our members with going forward. And then in addition to the monetary penalties, there's also the ability now for regulators to apply to the court for online interface orders. So Ian, what are they? What are online interface orders, and when can they be used by trading standards?
So I think the shorthand that David used for these in the DMCC evidence sessions is takedown powers. That's probably the kind of simplest shorthand. So they're an order that facilitates the taking down of content from the internet, or otherwise blocking content or warning users that offending content is coming up, or that kind of thing. But I think it's really important to put them in the proper statutory context. So these are not freestanding powers to take down content without reference to other enforcement proceedings. So it's not a workaround, if you like. You can't say, oh, I don't fancy enforcing against that trader, I think I'll just whip their website down. Instead, they're a last resort power that's built into the DMCC Part 3 framework. So you have to demonstrate that no other enforcement powers in the kind of traditional suite of enforcement powers, the powers that are similar to those that were available under the Enterprise Act, would be wholly effective in resolving the issue. And we envisage that being a reasonably high threshold. And I think the CMA's had these powers for a while and hasn't used them a great deal. But I think what they can be very useful for is providing a tool that officers can talk to internet service providers or web hosters or other companies that are facilitating the content being online, and explain that they do have power to go to court to resolve this if it's necessary, and that might help augment or perhaps make negotiations a bit more fruitful.
Yeah, really helpful. And David, if I can come to you, Ian mentioned there about the lobbying work and the push that lead officers, and particularly yourself, did in gaining this ability for trading standards to go to court for online interface orders. So how important are these? And do you think that it's an important step towards ensuring that our powers in trading standards are fit for purpose?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. I mean, for me, there's three benefits to this. One is they will be used, as Ian says, there are last resort powers, but they will be used in some big cases. Second thing is it's this leverage again. It's acting as a lever to get various internet intermediaries of some of the kinds Ian said there, and others too, online marketplaces as well. It's that leverage to get them to do the right thing in an informal way at an early stage. And the third thing, really, I would have to say, it's just taking local authority trading standards seriously as regulators. You know, why, you know, if we're being tasked with enforcing these things, we should have the same powers as, you know, as other bodies have, and that's how I see it. Even the last resort element of it, when these things are actually used in anger as well, doesn't seem to me to be something that you know, it gives us any problems, because that's the way we operate anyway. We look for pragmatic other ways to resolve things. We're always going to be trying easier, quicker ways to get things sorted. We're always going to be engaging with businesses to try and get them to do the right thing. That's the way we operate. And particularly on things like RIPA and RIPSA in Scotland for directed surveillance. I mean, that is a last resort where we have to, before we apply for something under that, we have to show that we've taken all their steps. So this is not unknown to trading standards. And I have to say as well, there are existing means as well through NTS's e-crime team. You know, there's that's still there as well, and officers can still engage and get support and help from NTS as well. So it's but it's overall it strengthens our position significantly, I feel.
And I'm just going to ask you, David, because I know we use so many acronyms in trading standards. Can you, particularly if we've got new officers watching, can you explain what RIPA stands for?
Sorry,
and RIPSA and also
yeah.
NTS, please?
Yeah, sure. Regulation of Investigative Powers Act, or the S is for the Scottish one. So it's for, I'm particularly thinking about covert surveillance that we do. NTS, National Trading Standards, so of course part of National Trading Standards operation is the crime team. That's what I was referring to there.
Yeah, and lots
No
of
more
officers...
acronyms from now on.
And lots of officers will be familiar with the process of contacting the crime team at the moment for takedowns, which is what you're talking about. And Andrew, I'd like to bring you in to the discussion to talk about the changes that are being introduced into the Act relating to the direct enforcement regime. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it differs from what you had previously at the CMA?
Yeah, we're very excited about the new powers. I mean, just to be clear, our sort of public position has been that all enforcers should have had access to those powers, including trading standards. That hasn't happened this time round, but obviously there's the possibility for that to change in the future. The key difference that the direct regime brings in is that we will make the initial decision about whether certain breaches of consumer law have occurred. That will be subject to appeal to the courts, so it doesn't remove the process from the courts. But if we do find that substantive law has been breached, we can impose the penalties that Ian was talking about. So it's the same set of penalties: 10% of global turnover for substantive breach, 5% for breach of undertakings, 1% for failure to comply to information notices. So that conveniently aligns the fining powers with the existing powers that we have under for the Competition Act. So that's great. That's long overdue from our perspective to kind of get businesses to take compliance with competition and consumer law equally seriously. That's really great. Obviously, hopefully that will give us some more teeth, get companies, particularly bigger companies, to kind of take us more seriously when we come and engage with them. As Ian said, with undertakings, it means that we can get quick informal resolution to cases, but have some bite and not have to go back to the start of the process if we want to take those forward. And the ability to fine for breach of information notices means that companies who kind of obstruct the process and hold it back won't be able to hold out whilst holding them to account. So we're really excited about all of that. We've produced, as Ian mentioned, some draft guidance. We'll be finalising that over the coming months. Might be out by the time people see this video, I guess. So we've got a lot to sort of get to grips with. In terms of, very briefly, how the process works, I think there's three key kind of points along the way. So there's a case opening process where we obviously inform the business that we're investigating them. There's then a PIN, a provisional infringement notice, where we say this is what we think you've done and here's the evidence that we've used to reach that decision. The parties can then make representations to us, so they can query it, they can challenge, and then we make a final decision with it through a final infringement notice. And then if the parties aren't happy with where things have got to, they can appeal us to the courts. So that's roughly how it works. There's lots more in the guidance. I don't think we've got time to go into detail on all of that, but that should be finalised in the next few weeks.
And Andrew, before we move on then to talk about some of the changes in Part 4 of the Act, the guidance that you mentioned, is there useful information in there about some of the penalties and calculations that officers might find useful to have a look at as well?
There's a lot of information in there about how we will calculate our penalties. The Department for Business sort of mandated that we provide clarity for, mainly I think, to help businesses understand how they would potentially be subject to penalties. But trading standards officers might find the way that we've approached setting out how we calculate the penalties helpful. They're not bound by that. They can take their own approach. Ultimately, it will be the courts that decide when civil penalties are brought through. But if you want a starting point for, well, how do we get our heads around this, or how might we start calculating these penalties, they might find something useful in there. So but it's worth a read anyway.
Absolutely. As anything, the more information that's available to us as officers, we find that really helpful. So any guidance that comes out is always helpful for us. And as I mentioned, as well as the civil enforcement changes that we've talked about in Part 3, there are also really important unfair commercial practice changes in Part 4 of the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act. Now, many of our members at CTSI will be familiar with the provisions of the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, and most of those provisions are going to be replaced by Part 4, Chapter 1 of the Act, including banned and prohibited practices. So, Andrew, how have banned and prohibited practices changed under the Act?
Well, a lot, and yet not much, interestingly. So, crucially, the government now has the power to add via secondary legislation to the list. Mm-hmm. So there could be new legislation in the future. That's obviously up to Department for Business and Parliament to add those provisions. A new ban practice has been added, and actually it's really 3 for the price of 1. There are 3 provisions in there. So the publication, commissioning or submission of fake consumer reviews is outlawed by the new ban practice. So that's a really good step forward. That consolidates a lot of really great work that my own organisation has done over the last few years in online reviews, but it will also make it easier for trading standards officers and other enforcers to take forward provisions in that space. There's been some minor drafting changes to quite a few of the provisions. That's mostly, I think, as Ian was saying, to sort of update the language of the regulations and kind of make it a bit more kind of British in terms of the legislation. Obviously, it was sort of European legislation originally. And there's also been some numerical changes. So do check before you put your provisions in that you've any claims in that you've got the right numbering, because as Sylvia's pointed out several times, the numbers aren't quite the same as you might imagine.
Oh, so officers that are very familiar with those practices have got some relearning to do as far as the numbers. And Sylvia, if I can bring you in there, what's your view on the fake reviews edition, and what impact do you think that will have?
I think in this digital world now, there are so many reviews online, and people need to know that what they're seeing is true, and they need to know that the reviews are genuine. So this new provision is very clear about what can and can't be done. I mean, as long as it's a true review, it's not a problem. But if you start commissioning reviews and they're not true, that's when the problem rears its ugly head, really, I suppose. It's the one thing that frustrates us is that this is a civil-only provision. Apart from the 2 that members are already aware of in the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, everything we could have taken criminal action. And I think it's quite frustrating when something that could be identified as fraud actually is civil only. But at least we've got it. There was a time when it wasn't actually going to go into the schedule practices. So that is a very positive action.
Thanks, Sylvia. And Andrew, can you briefly explain how the pricing requirements for businesses have been strengthened in the Act?
Yeah, so very interesting area. So Section 230 introduces a very specific provision that traders have to provide all the mandatory charges within the total price where there is an invitation to purchase. So there's several sort of steps in there as usual with principle-based legislation, but we think this is going to help make sure that consumers are aware of the final price that they're going to have to pay in order to get hold of the product. As usual, there are some sort of qualifications around that. So where the nature of the product means that the price can't be reasonably calculated in advance, traders have to give consumers enough information that they can calculate it for themselves. So this is quite a big change. Obviously, the CPUTRs already prohibit misleading pricing and drip pricing, which is what this new provision in 230 is really about. But what this does is to take the transactional decision test away. So effectively, you could think about this as another type of banned practice. It isn't in the banned list, but this is like a banned practice in that you don't have to think about the impact on the average consumer's decision. It's just that if you fail to provide that information. So we've tried to provide some guidance on that in our separate guidance on unfair commercial practices, which is out and will be issuing again, hopefully in the next few weeks or months. So do have a look at that. It's led to some quite interesting discussions about what is mandatory, for example, and as usual, like all of these new concepts. But I think it's important to understand that drip pricing is already prohibited. This just tightens up the law, but I think it's a really useful provision and might sort of combat some of the late dripping of admin fees, for example, if people can't avoid them.
And if I can add on to that, I think this is the fact that it no longer is a transactional decision is very important, because before we were looking at misleading actions or misleading omissions and missing material information, and you always had to show that that would affect the transactional decision. Now we're saying it's not just pricing, there are other things which a trader has to tell the consumer right at the beginning, and that includes things like their identity, an address where documents can be served, things that are really matter to enforcers. They're now included as well in this invitation to purchase. So that's a bit of a change for officers, and that's a very positive change.
Excellent, thanks Sylvia. And what other consumer protection changes are being introduced by the Act that trading standards officers need to be aware of, Andrew?
Oh gosh, there's a lot. I'll try and be brief. I mean, I guess, for the benefit of my colleagues, I should point out that the DMCC does introduce our digital markets unit as well, which primarily has a competition focus, will hopefully improve things for consumers more broadly. If we talk about the consumer specific things in parts 3 and 4, there are some definitional changes. So I guess 3 concepts have moved a little bit. So commercial practice and the definition of trader, both of those have been, the breadth of that has been clarified, and we think that's really helpful for making sure that kind of practices like fake reviews fall into the legislation. We think there's a very, very helpful new concept of the UK connection, which will make it much easier to deal with practices being targeted at the UK from abroad for those. But one of the benefits of those definitions is that it's basically kind of squashed all of those definitions together from what was a kind of a bit of a mismatch of different pieces of legislation that had different definitions. So that will hopefully, once people get used to it, make it a lot easier to take things forward. We've mentioned online interface orders. I won't go into detail there. I think on the unfair commercial practices provisions, I've mentioned 2 things. So there's been, I think, some quite helpful streamlining around the materiality requirements. So for those familiar with professional diligence and aggressive practices within the CPUTRs, for example, some specific additional requirements that, for example, consumers don't have their behaviour materially distorted, or they don't make an informed decision. That's been removed. So though we still will have to show that there's been an impact on the transactional decision, that will become the kind of key materiality provision across the board. And that's actually really, I think that's really helpful, and will, I think, hopefully make it easier to make use of those provisions. There hasn't been as much use, I think, of those as I had imagined originally. There's been another set of streamlining around what I call the modulations of the average consumer. So there's the average targeted consumer and the average member of a vulnerable group of consumers. And again, that's been streamlined to remove some of the kind of extraneous wording that was in the original Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and then got mapped across into the CPUTRs, and that's now been kind of thought about a bit more carefully, and we think that's all very helpful and will hopefully make it easier to take into account vulnerable consumers' interests in particular, which was a bit tricky given some of the thresholds before. And then just finally, like I said, there's a lot here. Part 4, as you've rightly said, the key provisions really from our perspective are around unfair commercial practices, but there's 3 other areas of change that are coming in a bit later. So there are some new rules on subscriptions, which there is a live consultation by the Department for Business closing fairly soon, and there'll be some guidance on that in due course. So there's some new rules for businesses, but they won't have to take those into account until next spring, and we'll be hearing more about that, I think, as we go on. And then two other areas where there have been some tweaks. There's been some new rules introduced around Christmas savings schemes, so people remember Fair Pack, for example. That's a rather perhaps belated response to that, but to tighten the law up around that, to make sure that consumers' deposits are protected when they're offered by businesses. And then there are also some changes to alternative dispute resolution systems, which I think are a really good fit with Ian's kind of characterisation of some of the legislation. We just need to tighten things up so that the UK had control of those provisions rather than them being subject to the official journal of the European Union. So there's lots of things there. That's only a sort of short list, but lots of really exciting changes for everybody to get to grips with, and so no shortage of conversations like this, or indeed guidance on it.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really great big question to answer, and you did a great job of doing a good summary. Thank you. And if I come to Sylvia then, just to add to that, what do you think, based on what Andrew has said with the changes of definitions, which changes do you think are going to have the biggest impact for trading standards?
I think that the definitions are simplified, and I think that really helps officers to understand, and also businesses to understand. One of the ones I think is most significant is the change in definition of vulnerable consumer. Because in the past you had to show that a practice affected only one group, and there were all these different steps you had to take, whereas now it's much simplified, and it basically says you could be vulnerable because of the circumstances you're in. And that means that people who've been bereaved or people whose houses are flood damaged will be considered to be vulnerable, and therefore the level of protection is different because you're looking at the average consumer who is vulnerable, and they might make different decisions. So I think that's a very important part. The other thing that I've raised before, and I think it's important to highlight, is the fact that the scheduled practices numberings will change. So people have got to be very careful to make sure that they don't just use the number that they know it was, because it may not be still the same number. And one other thing that I think is probably very significant to us is this invitation to purchase, and the fact there's no longer the requirement for transactional decision, because that makes a big difference in relation to when you're looking at a trader. As soon as they give you the main characteristics and the price, then if they haven't given all the other information, which includes compulsory charges, it includes the identity of the trader, it includes an address where documents can be served, then there is a breach, and it gives us the powers to be able to move things on. And I think that's very significant.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, some really important things there. And then, David, if I can come to you, Andrew mentioned the additional changes that will be coming in at a later point in time. What difference do you think that they will make to the consumer protection landscape?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell at this stage, but I think it is really important that we in Trading Standards don't ignore these things, because it's completely understandable that most people in Trading Standards are going to be looking at the unfair commercial practices stuff, they're going to be looking at civil enforcement stuff, and are going to prioritise these areas, and that's completely understandable, probably right. But these other areas that Andrew described earlier, they do impact on trading standards. We mustn't ignore them. So officers need to be aware of them. And in particular, I would say subscription traps. I would say when the savings schemes and the ADR things will always be a little bit peripheral to our daily work. I think every single department and probably every single officer at some point will be dealing with subscription contracts in some way. So 18 months down the line before they come in full, but I think we need to be thinking about them just now. And, it's another thing, back to your point earlier, Gemma, about continuing assistance and guidance from CTSI for officers. And I think we're planning some stuff on particularly the subscription contracts, easy for me to say, coming soon on that.
Definitely. And that links in nicely to the final question that I want to pose to Sylvia about what we're doing at CTSI to support our members and the trading standards profession to help them to prepare and get used to these changes. So what are we doing other than the discussion with experts that we're doing today to help?
Well, this discussion is just an introduction to the legislation so that our members are aware. But we are going to be running a series of webinars, half-day webinars on the criminal side, half-day webinars on the civil side, to give people the overview so they've got the tools that they're going to need. We're also going to be updating Business Companion, which is for businesses, but we know that trading standards officers use Business Companion a lot as well. So we're doing what we can. We will be continuing to engage with members. We will be speaking at conference. Gemma and I, and David as well, I believe you're joining us as well. We'll be doing a masterclass at conference. So we'll be going through all of the elements then. And hopefully by the time we get to conference, we'll have gleaned questions from members, areas we may not have thought about, and we'll be able to raise those and discuss them as well. So we really want members to contact us with questions, with queries, with comments, and then we can incorporate that to make sure that we are giving you what you need.
Thanks, Sylvia. That's really helpful. So if you do want to book on any of the webinars, they're free for CTSI members, so you can book those through the CTSI website. And the CTSI conference is taking place in Blackpool this year between the 17th and 19th of June. So hopefully we will see lots of our members there. And as Sylvia said, we'll be able to pick up some of those questions that you pose to us throughout the webinars and see if we can come back to you with some further developments as we learn as well. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for your valuable contribution to today's discussion. And to our members, Sylvia, David and I will look forward to seeing you at the webinars and hopefully at conference as well. And we're really looking forward to hearing your views about the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act.